One of the most common sources of confusion amongst Italian learners is when to use the auxiliary verb or helping verb essere, to be, versus the auxiliary or helping verb avere, to have, in compound tenses such as il passato prossimo or past tense. This kind of confusion is highly surprising because there's a very simple answer to that. A lot of naysayers will say, oh, there's no simple answer when it comes to Italian. Well, I wouldn't be so certain about that. Italian is not as chaotic and unruly as many learners tend to believe. The real problem is that languages, in Italian in particular, are usually taught in the wrong way, and learners, for the most, tend to use the wrong method. Now, talking about Italian being all over the place, and in general the complexity of a language, I'd like to go off on a tangent for a few seconds and bring into the discussion a more authoritative version of my perspective. I'm talking about this guy who's known to be the greatest philologist that ever existed, Friedrich Nietzsche, no less. So let me read a passage from one of his books. The history of language is the history of a process of abbreviation. Now, when he says abbreviation, he includes simplification. It is on the basis of this quick understanding that the speakers, they unite together closely and ever more closely. The greater the danger, the greater is the need to reach agreement quickly and easily as to what has to be done. Not to misunderstand one another in situations of danger is an absolute necessity in human relations. So yes, there's a ton of complexity to a language, especially if you go down the linguistics path and break it down into morphology and phonetics and syntax. But when it comes to communication, daily interactions between speakers, answers are easy. And if they're not easy enough, you have to make them easier. It's not going to work. So back to essere and avere as auxiliary verbs. So I was saying there's a simple answer to this question. We always use the verb avere in compound verb tenses, including il passato prossimo, except when there's a moving verb. In that case, we use the auxiliary verb essere. At this point, we need to understand what's a moving verb in Italian. A moving verb is any verb that describes a motion from point A to point B, either literally or figuratively. Here's a list of moving verbs. Let's start off with the ones that describe an actual physical motion. Andare, venire, tornare, ritornare, cadere, entrare, uscire, salire, scendere, partire, arrivare, stare, restare, rimanere. Now let's go with the ones that indicate motion, but figuratively. Diventare, nascere, morire, crescere. Let's break them down a little bit. So the verb diventare indicates a transition from one state to another. So if I say something like sono diventato povero, I'm indicating that I used to be rich, but then I transitioned point A to point B to being poor. Nascere, from inside to outside, to be born, right? Morire, to die, from here to the hereafter, and so on. So these verbs are figurative because they don't indicate a motion from point A to point B the way that we intended with the verb andare or venire, but you should think of that action as such. So we got this far, we might as well understand what are not moving verbs in Italian. Many verbs that in English are considered moving verbs are not considered moving verbs in Italian, and that's why a lot of learners get confused. One of the examples is the verb to walk. In English, we can say, I walked to the park this morning. But in Italian, we cannot use the verb camminare. We need to say something like, sono andato al parco a piedi stamattina. So, andare a piedi. Camminare simply describes a way that the action is carried on, a way that you reach your destination. Another one is guidare. In English, we can say, I drove to the office this morning. In Italian, we cannot use the verb guidare for that. In Italian, we can use the verb andare in macchina. Sono andato in ufficio in macchina questa mattina. Because to drive, guidare, in Italian simply means to be behind the wheel as opposed to sitting in the passenger seat. Volare, to fly. So we don't say, I flew to Rome last week. No, to fly simply means, in Italian, volare means to simply go from one place to another on a plane, so to be on a plane. But you can say andare in aereo. Sono andato a Roma in aereo. Visitare? Doctors visit patients. We don't visit people in Italian. We use the expression andare a trovare. So instead of saying I visited my mother last week, you can say sono andato a trovare mia madre la settimana scorsa. And then viaggiare, travel. We don't say ho viaggiato a Firenze. We simply say sono andato a Firenze. I'm going to give you a few sentences that you can listen to a few times over so you can acquaint yourself with the sound of these expressions in context. Di solito prendo l'aereo quando vado da Milano a Napoli. Generalmente vado a trovare mia madre 3 volte alla settimana. Di solito vado al lavoro in macchina, ma qualche volta in estate vado in bicicletta. Andiamo a Bari ogni mese per comprare dell'olio di oliva. Andiamo spesso al parco a piedi in primavera e in estate. Luca porta il cane fuori 3 volte al giorno. Di solito va in macchina o a piedi al lavoro. In estate vado spesso a Bergamo a trovare mia zia. Alright, so you've come to the end of my video. Today you'll learn how to use the verbs essere and avere as auxiliary verbs in compound tenses in Italian, such as il passato prossimo. You'll learn the difference between moving and non-moving verbs and how to replace non-moving verbs with the appropriate expressions in Italian. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more content. And if you have any pressing doubts or questions, please leave a comment in the comment section. I'll be happy to address them.